Okay, welcome everyone to this big blether this afternoon. My name is Julia Fenby. I'm Education Officer for Creativity with Education Scotland, and absolutely delighted to welcome you all here for this big blether to hear more about this report, which Gayle is going to tell you all about or introduce in a moment, and we're going to hear lots more about it. And I won't do any more introductions, so I'll hand over to Gayle Gorman, Chief Exec of Education Scotland. Thank you, Gayle.
Thanks, Julia, and welcome, colleagues. I'm absolutely delighted to be welcoming both the education sector and the arts sector to this session here tonight. It's really great that we're able to do this and that people can come together. I'm absolutely delighted to be celebrating the launch of this report, which highlights just how important and valuable the arts are for children and young people's lives and their learning. It's really exemplifying that and brings it to the fore. Here at Education Scotland, we wholeheartedly embrace the arts and culture as a powerful tool and for the role that they play in supporting children and young people's well-being. I've seen the impact of that firsthand in many of the projects and work I've been involved with myself over the years, and know how central it is to supporting our children and young people's well-being, particularly if we think about during the times that we're facing now. As our learners begin to return to school, which most of them did on Monday in various ways, it's great to see that we're working holistically as various sectors coming together with our communities and partners, such as arts and cultural organisations, who we can help work alongside and with collectively to make sure that we build back a better and improved offer for our young people and our children across Scotland. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Nicola Benedetti, one of our greatest talents, and a very proud daughter of Scotland and a huge supporter of the arts and education. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Nicola, and a warm welcome.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure for me to be here with you all today. I think I'm going to avoid saying the words big blether because it seems like it's a bit of a tongue twister. I've heard a few people get that wrong, but wonderful name, wonderful to join you all. Education Scotland and Gayle, of course, but also my dear friend Nicola Colleen, who was important in arranging me speaking with you all today, and I am probably her biggest fan ever, so it's really an honour for me to be in the company of you all. So I'm going to speak very generally about my views on the importance of music education. Obviously we'll hear a lot more about the report later, and I can't wait to hear more details on it, but just from the perspective of someone who has advocated for and believes in the power of music and the arts in schools and in our communities, but also from someone who's travelled around the world, travelled widely since a young age, since I was 15 or 16, and seen huge varying levels of music education from a million different perspectives. And I want to start just by saying how heartened and encouraged and proud I am to see meetings like this today happening. For a start, just having individuals that are present here so invested in spending time and effort on this subject and initiative is so heartwarming for me, but equally to see groups formed like the Arts in Education Recovery Group. But just more generally, the collective leadership and collaboration demonstrated in Scotland, and I'm always looking at it from that international perspective, is just always so uplifting and motivating. So obviously it won't come as a surprise to any of you that I believe that the arts and music are integral to a great education, because the arts really are our stories in all their colourfulness and complexity, their beautifulness, their unpleasantness, and the unfathomable diversity of the human story. Music in particular is the art of all the things that we can't see or touch. It's feelings and thoughts and offerings of generosity or our vulnerability or our openness, addresses and communicates and passes entirely invisible things, from people creating sound to people receiving that sound. It has, and we all definitely have experienced this in our life, it has the power to capture us, to make us feel so many complex things at once. It can lift us high into optimism and accompany us during times of deep hurt and pain. But today obviously is about music and music. Today is about education and mixing music with the arts, and mixing music with education can sometimes be a complex topic, but it's a debate that's as old as time, from the Greeks to the Romans to, old records I've seen of Elizabethan schools, pedagogical beliefs from all over the world, arguing over the subject of music and the arts, the poetry of life in education, and arguing a lot over what that actually is, more than whether the benefits are real or not. Now, I personally have considered music and the arts in education deeply and tried to force on myself a lot of objectivity towards this subject, trying to not just kind of please myself and my community and tell myself what I want to hear, but continually come to the same conclusion that this area in particular is unique in what it can provide, if taught well and considered carefully. And I emphasize that because I know from firsthand experience the abundance of carefully considered music education that exists currently in Scotland. With the recent lockdown in mind, I want to focus on certain parts of its power. To begin with, the unbelievably freeing effect of music and the arts in education, a freeing effect, a liberating effect, a physical and psychological impact that is quite often imperceptible. It can sometimes be very perceptible when you see the amount of joy and exuberance from people achieving something in music or the arts, but sometimes it's imperceptible and often very difficult to quantify, which can sometimes make our justification job more difficult to quantify. But it attacks the very things that, once all and said or done, are most important to us. To begin with, how we relate to one another. If you look at some of those interviews of the oldest people to have survived, they look back on their life and they talk about what was important to them. It's always relating to relationships. It's always about how they treated other people, how other people treated them, their relationship to their fellow human beings, how we connect to other humans, our family and friends, and even our wider commitment to humanity, to being capable of empathy and understanding for those that we've never met and never interacted with. But also very important when it comes to dealing with your future adult working life. So problem solving with confidence and creativity, finding and embracing your individual way of doing things. And lastly, the reinforcing of solid, enlightened, positive, high-level foundations. So when we have faith in the foundations, when we walk on solid ground from an emotional standpoint, culturally, civically, we are more relaxed, we are more free, more comfortable in ourselves, and therefore much more accepting of others. Now, there's also the big question of who we are, and that's a global question today more than ever. But thinking of Scotland right now, where does Scotland want to be, and what does it want to look like during this time and into our future? How can we form an education that reaches forward, that dares to dream and create, that doesn't just spruce up and kind of, repackage and manage all that's already been said and done, but moves forward with confidence, with consideration, with investment of time, thought and resources, and conducts itself with integrity. Significant change can take place through great storytelling, and the arts is home to the greatest of storytelling. Clear, vivid, emotive, careful storytelling. This is what the arts at their best can do. tell the stories that we want to tell and that we want to envisage for ourselves and for our community, but it can also make more palatable, I'm not sure if that's the right word, but it can help us digest the stories that we need to hear and we need to tell other people, but perhaps don't want to. So the question over what do we collectively believe in, what is our culture, what human standards do we hold each other to, can all be reinforced and lifted or flattened and brought down by the quality of our cultural education. And again, music and the arts are integral to that cultural education. Yes, you could argue that politics and civics take care of this, but sometimes we get overwhelmed with so much dry information that we can become more confused than we can clearer thinking. So the artist in all of us, the improvised type of experience that could, if we all collectively believe enough in its impact, permeate our education system and our community. When it's shared and expressed genuinely and not for commercial gain or a popularity context, this could help us enormously. It could help us painlessly communicate with each other better, bring people together, have activities that everyone can invest in, commit to, feel maybe a bit vulnerable in front of each other, but feel so much prouder collectively after. It could help us painlessly and subliminally ask and try to answer the large questions that collectively we find hard to ask and hard to answer. But storytelling of high quality doesn't just happen by itself. It has to be nurtured, addressed, carefully and considered. It has to be worked and reworked, because stories, as we all know, with bright colours and emotion, have a huge amount of power. And history tells us that those stories can be used for the greatest good and can be used for the most phenomenal destruction. But when we hold each other to account and we exercise collective leadership, we elevate each other and we inspire each other to do better. When we exercise humility and curiosity, when we begin to discover and realize the endless potential for a human's ability to find creative solutions to problems, we all benefit and we all do better as a collective. But I want to say also that I don't believe that music and art in education should be just another added pressure on children, yet another thing for them to achieve in a day and to add to the list of boxes to tick every day. Music should help form and strengthen the ground that we stand on. It should be an integrated, ethereal layer that helps us understand the why of all the other things that we do in education. It's the part of education that deals, I think, most beautifully with meaning. I'm just looking at the time. I want to close by referring to the excellent report by the Arts in Education Recovery Group, and to add my thoughts on creative practitioners and education safely delivering face-to-face work in schools, communities, and with families. I believe strongly that there has never been a time of more need for people of all ages and stages, but certainly for young people, for diverse experiences, for vivid and tangible 3D interaction, a release of emotion, of expression, a means of communicating that is more or different to our everyday methods of communication. But of course, this has to be done with the utmost conscientiousness and care, which is demonstrated, reinforced throughout this report. As stated in the report, exciting, innovative, high-quality creative work has been having a significant impact on children and young people in Scotland. Let us try to see coming out of this pandemic as a golden opportunity for creativity. Out of hardship and destruction always comes newness and always comes creativity. This is an opportunity for positive change for all of us. The music organisations of this country are keen and willing to share. Oh, yeah, this is what I'm trying to say. Sorry, I just kept reading. I'm trying to say that to take it from me and from many others that will, I know, agree with me. The music organisations, both that are professional music performing organisations and those working in music education, are so keen and willing to share what we know and what we have and what has been built up through an aggregate of hundreds and hundreds of people studying music from the age of 4, like I did. We're just sometimes not all that good at communicating this, nor of understanding from an infrastructural and practical perspective exactly how to share what we have and support successful delivery of it. But groups like the Arts and Education Recovery Group, which brings together many of these organisations, are committed to ensuring that children and young people in Scotland benefit from the unique qualities of engaging with the arts, culture and creativity during the pandemic and beyond. And so to continue building relationships, to work closely together and to create the spaces to come together and find ways to increase the opportunities for children and young people is an exciting and positive, it's a positive that has come out of this pandemic. And I am hugely excited to see the next steps that can be achieved when we all work together. So it's been my pleasure to chat with you all. I look forward to hearing what everyone else has to say and to the questions later. Thank you so much. Who's next?
Katie, I think it's over to you. Thanks.
You're on mute at the moment, Katie.
Thank you. Sorry, all this screen sharing and unmuting. Okay, is that me? Thanks very much, Nicola. That was a really inspiring start to the session this afternoon. I'm Katie McMillan from Research Scotland, and I'm here just to give you a little bit of an overview of the research which we have done over the past few months, really exploring this issue around the safety and how to make safe face-to-face working with children and young people in the field of creativity during the pandemic. As Nicola said, the research was published last week, and I'd really encourage you to have a look. It's available on the Creative Scotland website. But I'm going to do a short presentation this afternoon just to talk you through the main lessons that we identified from the work. Just to talk to you a little bit about the work that we did, first of all, the research, as Nicola explained, was for the Arts and Education Recovery Group. And this group was really keen to get some strong, concrete examples of how face-to-face creative work was happening with children and young people during the pandemic. So they asked us to develop 8 case studies of work that was happening both in schools and in the wider community setting with children and young people around learning. The group was really keen that this was rapid learning, so the case studies did happen quite quickly. The work took place between October and December 2020, a very busy time for many of the organisations that we were working with, and really focused on identifying lessons learned and the importance of this work very quickly, so that that could then be used immediately as we work through the pandemic, and we can build that experience into future delivery. Just to tell you a little bit about the case studies, so there are 8 case studies within the report. We worked with the Arts and Education Recovery Group to identify options for a range of different case studies, and we talked to the group a lot about what was known about what was happening in schools and in the wider community environment, and tried to make sure that we got a good mix of different types of activity, different age groups, some in school, some in community, and a range of different geographies, art forms and ages and so on. We ended up with 5 of the case studies being in a school environment and 3 being in a wider community environment. And I'm just going to very quickly tell you a little bit about which case studies we focused in on. But there are people who are here today from these case studies. So if you have any detailed questions, I'm sure they'll be able to help and to chat about their experience as well. We ended up with 2 case studies in primary schools in Scotland, and these were Big Noise with Systema, focusing on music with primary school pupils, and our case study focused in on the work that was happening in Dundee. We also developed a case study on the Baby Strings project in Glasgow, which again is music with primary school pupils in the Glasgow area. In terms of case studies in secondary schools, we had 3 case studies there. We worked with Articulate, which is an organisation working with young people with care experience in East Renfrewshire, and they were doing some work focusing mainly on graffiti art in a secondary school in East Renfrewshire. We worked with the Edinburgh Book Festival and Spartans, which was doing a project around spoken word and poetry within Edinburgh in an alternative school setting, so with the Spartans school provision. And we also worked with SHMU in Aberdeenshire, which was doing some work around foundation apprenticeships for secondary school pupils, focusing on a range of different art forms there. And then we also developed 3 case studies in the wider community setting. So we worked with Art Sparks through Jupiter Artland, which works outdoors in West Lothian with young children aged 3 to 10 across a range of art forms. We worked with Buff and Sheen, a project funded through Imaginate, where there was live performance in people's gardens in Edinburgh, specifically for families with children with additional support needs. And we also worked with the Expecting Something project run by Starcatchers. Again, this was an outdoor project in Fife, working with young parents and babies across a range of different art forms. And there's much more detail on how these projects ran within the report itself, if you want to take a look. Just to tell you a little bit about what we did for each case study. As I said, it was undertaken between October and December 2020, so it was a really busy and pressured time for lots of the projects that were involved. And we had to work really closely with the projects to try and find a way of speaking to all the different people involved in a way that suited them during this busy time. So we held online and phone discussions with the range of stakeholders involved in the project. So this was often young children or young people, or in some instances their parents and carers if they were particularly young or if the project focused on parents. We spoke with teachers, head teachers, deputy heads who were involved in the project to get their perspective on how it worked. We spoke to the artists and those delivering, so tutors and others involved in delivering the projects. And we also spoke to community organisations who were working with these artists in partnership. I'd like to say thank you so much to all of the projects who helped us with this work, because it was a challenging time to be going out and doing this fieldwork. And obviously for all of the school-based case studies, we had to get permission from the Director of Education to go in and speak to the pupils and to the teachers and take up their time. I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about what we found in terms of impact. The case studies explored how this work was possible, so the practicalities around it, but we also really explored the value of the work. What difference was this work making to the children, young people and their families at this very difficult time? We found overall the work was having a hugely positive impact on children, on young people and on their families. I'm going to highlight a few key areas, but there's much more detail on this in the report. It was really interesting to hear Nicola talking about connections and relationships and the importance of art in bringing about those connections with friends, with family and just with the wider community as well. And we found really good, strong evidence that these projects were absolutely helping children and young people to make new friends, to cement and create stronger links with their peers, and also to build positive relationships with adults. And as we were speaking to people, they were saying during lockdown, during the pandemic, the importance of these relationships really can't be underestimated. This was a really key aspect of impact at this time. We found that the projects were absolutely supporting around access and equity, so providing opportunities for people who may not otherwise have any opportunity to undertake creative activity or artistic activity. We found really significant evidence around health and well-being. We talked to lots and lots of children, young people and their families who talked about people feeling calmer, more focused, more able to kind of manage their feelings and their emotions, able to find their own voice and talk about what's important to them, able to manage their moods and their energy, and also able to access a safe and welcoming space through the project. So really good evidence about health and well-being of young people. We found in relation to attendance and engagement at school, good evidence that because young people were enjoying the activity, they were wanting to learn, they wanted to go to school to undertake the creative activity, but it also helped them have a positive attitude towards learning and had a positive impact on wider subjects beyond the creative activity. So it really helped with that engagement and enjoyment of school. As Nicola was talking about earlier in terms of skills, we found hugely positive impact in terms of wider life skills, so not just around art or music or the specific art form that the project was focused on, but absolutely skills around leadership, teamwork, wider life skills, young people gaining accreditation and awards because of taking part in the projects, and young people really thinking about their goals and aspirations in life because of taking part. And then finally, in terms of impact, again, reflecting on what Nicola was saying, the happiness, the joy of being involved in these artistic projects, again, couldn't be underestimated. People really valued being able to see children and young people happy and joyful, particularly in such a difficult time for many children, young people and families. Within the report, there are lots and lots of quotes and examples from children, from teachers, from the tutors, from parents and from young people. But here are just a selection. So a child saying, "I feel like I've achieved something." A parent saying it's been huge for their mental health. And a teacher saying, "For me, I think it's a transformative thing, the whole project." So people gave really good evidence from their perspectives about the difference that these projects were making. We talked a lot with the projects about how they had managed to make their activity happen during this challenging time. And we went into quite a lot of detail about the precautions and the things that the projects had to think about in order to deliver their activity. Thinking specifically about in-school activity, projects were very clear that they followed all of the guidelines that were issued by Scottish Government. They revised their approach to the guidelines regularly as the guidelines were reviewed. So they had many versions of different risk assessments that they had produced as the context changed. You can imagine during October to December was a time when things were opening up, but then the restrictions were coming back in again. So lots of people talked about having lots of iterations of different risk assessments and having to regularly review guidelines. Risk assessments weren't seen as something which was static, but they were absolutely a live document and something that people shared with partners, shared with parents and families and young people, and adapted as guidelines changed. In relation to school activity, the guidance on masks again was changing around about this time, but lots of the projects talked about how the adults wore masks when in school, and some of the older, younger people who were taking part also had to think about mask wearing. So that was absolutely built into the risk assessments. Some of the projects in school had to think quite carefully about social distancing, clearly distancing adults to children, but in some cases the young people involved also had to distance. The projects thought very carefully about the space that they delivered the activity in. Sometimes they needed a much bigger space than they would have needed previously. Some worked with much smaller groups or had less mixing, so only worked with one class at a time or worked with a bubble within a class, and had to think very carefully if there was any mixing between classes or between schools about how distancing was maintained. Within schools, projects also had to think carefully about movement. So if there were visitors, adult visitors to the school, how did they move around the school safely? How did they enter and exit the school? How did parents drop and pick safely? And how did they move around within the school safely? Lots of thought given to cleaning and to quarantining equipment. So lots of hand sanitising, cleaning of equipment, not sharing equipment between different groups of children and young people. But what the project said was, over time, the schools were very clear about what their arrangements were. Most of the time, they worked with the schools just to make sure that they fell in line with what the in-school arrangements were. And also that the children and young people were getting very used to this. So this wasn't something that was a challenge for the children and young people. They absolutely understood the need for this and began to take ownership for some of the things like cleaning of equipment. And finally, no singing. The projects mentioned the loss of singing within their projects, but began to replace that with things like rhythm, pulse or spoken word to make sure that they could still explore the benefits of that kind of activity. In terms of precautions for out-of-school activity, it was really interesting that the 3 community-based projects that we worked with transferred their activity entirely outdoors, and I'm going to come on and talk a little bit about what they learned from that in a minute, but all 3 of them moved to having entirely outdoor activity, which they felt mitigated a lot of the risks that were involved in bringing people together. We asked people quite a bit about what actually made the in-school activity happen. A lot of the projects were already in school before the pandemic, so they already had a good relationship with the teachers and with the senior leadership within the school. Projects mentioned that it was easier to get things started where either it was part of the curriculum, so maybe young people would gain an award or accreditation, or it was built into the programme, or if the school, if the teachers and the head teachers clearly recognised the benefit of the activity and were committed to it, perhaps from previously being involved in it, from seeing really strong evaluation evidence, or from recognising the value of the work. In some cases, schools mentioned that artists were really seen as members of the staff team anyway, so they just followed the same precautions with those artists as they would with other members of the team. As I mentioned before, lots of joint planning and discussion, and often in terms of getting things started, projects felt that it was the positive attitudes of the head teachers, of senior leadership, and also of local authority senior education officials, which made things happen. If people said that it was possible to explore these projects, they felt more confident going off and finding out how to make things work within the school environment. On outdoor learning, we did find that all 3 projects, which were community-based, transferred across to outdoor learning. Initially, this was as a way of making the activity possible, so they felt that they could continue by taking things outdoors. They worked in very small groups at first and took quite a careful and cautious approach, but actually the projects mentioned that over time they found this approach more impactful, so they thought in the future that they would stay outdoors, they would retain an element of outdoor activity because it was so effective in connecting children with nature, building bonds between the children and young people, and the children enjoyed the activity so much. Just finally, to tell you a little bit about the kind of lessons learned about online learning, we weren't specifically looking at this. We were much more interested in the kind of face-to-face activity, but over time, people were moving from face-to-face to online activity, depending on the restrictions, and they did express a number of issues which are quite useful in terms of lessons. Overall, the projects found that online learning did work well if maybe the project already knew the participants and had worked with them face-to-face, if the group, the children and young people, knew one another, if they kept things short and sharp, didn't have the lessons lasting too long, and if they had a mix of online and offline activities, often supported with things like activity packs and resources so that people could continue their learning offline. However, as soon as projects managed to offer face-to-face opportunities, they found that children and young people had such a clear preference for that. So they found that online learning was useful as a stopgap, but wasn't something that necessarily they would continue beyond the restrictions. So just to finish up by talking about kind of advice for others, overall, the projects were saying they had to be really flexible and patient over this time. Guidelines changed, partner expectations changed over time, and people had different ideas about what was possible and what should be attempted during the restrictions. They had to work very closely with partners. They had to try to take a sensible and cautious approach, so trying to get the benefit for the children and young people, but while also being careful about that. They also talked about having to support and connect with parents. So a number of the projects found that it was reasonably easy to work with children and young people in a different way, but parents took a little longer to adapt. So they had to take a little bit more effort to try and bring the parents along with them. And then finally, the projects talked to others. So everybody was going through the same experience. They talked to others who were in a similar position and learned from them and shared their own experience. So that's me finished, but just to finish up, just to say thank you so much to all of the people who took part in these case studies. We couldn't possibly have done it without you, and everybody gave up their time at such a challenging time. So we really value your contribution. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Katie. That was really, really informative and lots of information there to help us guide our way through the report. Thank you so much. So now we are on to the Q&A session, which I'm going to try and facilitate while looking at your quiz. So either if you could raise your virtual hand, because I can't see your hand otherwise, which in most screens is in the top bar beside the microphone and camera. If you want to raise your hand there, then I'll bring you in, switch your camera on, ask your question. It's up to you. Or pop a question in the chat bar, and again we'll try and keep an eye on that to pick up any comments. So does anyone want to kick us off with an opening question?
There's a question in the chat, Gayle, which is, this is all fantastic work. How can we continue to influence policy so all kids in Scotland can get access to the arts in a big way? Okay, now these are questions that Nicola or Katie or myself can answer. So Katie, do you want to maybe comment on that, and then I'll go to Nicola, or how do you want to start? I can see Nicola, so I'm afraid I'm going to pick on you first.
I was just going to say I would be inclined to say, could you answer that, Gayle, over myself?
Okay, I'll kick off then. So I think it's important that we have things like this. We have reports, that we have the sharing of best practice, because that really is what helps to influence the policy. The more that we can showcase something we're not always that good at, particularly in education, showcase the work that's going on, the partnership work, and hear the authentic voices of particularly the students and young people who've been involved. I think that is probably the biggest influence that we can make on policy. And of course, all of us advocating these joint approaches help as well. But Katie, did you want to come in there?
No, I think you've summed it up, Gayle. I mean, from our perspective, the research has to be kind of independent and robust and really focused on demonstrating impact. And then I think it's over to you to try to influence policy. So to use this coming from not invested place, you know, we're not about lobbying. This is very independent research. So then what do you do? What does the Arts and Education Recovery Group and what do others do to use that research and to use the information in that to influence others?
Yeah, thanks, Katie. Okay, does anyone else want to come in with a question? Don't be shy. I can see one in the chat. Okay, so this is: the pandemic's almost given artists a jump start and an opportunity to demonstrate the power the arts have for the well-being of young people. How can we make sure that we don't regress back to the sidelines of the curriculum as we have been in more recent years? I'll maybe kick that one off. This is about curriculum and give others time to come in. I think that's true about an awful lot of things that have happened during the pandemic. I'm very keen that we don't regress to what education was before the pandemic, because it's very different now. And this arts at the heart of that, I think, is very, very strongly now represented. I think that what will help us not regress back is, you know, reports like this, that independent view, but also I think listening to our children and young people. Today, the UNCRC hopefully is going through the Scottish Parliament in terms of children's rights as we speak. And actually, when we talk to, as I have the privilege of doing regularly, to children and young people, one of the things they say is most essential to them is arts and experiencing and participating in arts. So I think if we keep that at the heart and we keep health and well-being of our young people, which is now much more central to what we're doing in education, that actually will stop us regressing. But I don't know if Nicola or Katie, you want to come in?
Yeah, just to add one thing to that, which is in a time of increased pressure, and this is obviously also a huge time of creativity and opportunity, but in a time of increased pressure to kind of do this, like you're sort of holding on to what you have and what's safest, I think is so tempting. But that openness and bravery to look left and right, to really share what you've discovered, but also have the bravery to realize, well, maybe you didn't come up with the answer for this one, but probably somebody somewhere did, and to collectivize that mass of creativity and communicate as much as possible, I think is going to be our friend. And that's more possible to do in Scotland than it is in other countries. And we've always got to remember that, the fact that, you know, that there's that possibility of ease of communication.
I absolutely agree. I mean, I think that the report showed really clear evidence around health and well-being and that kind of happiness and engagement in a school environment. That there's really good evidence now that by doing this activity, you're not just developing arts and creativity, but you're actually helping with wider engagement with school. And I think that focusing on that element, that kind of health and well-being and the calmness, the joy, the happiness that people get around that is really central to moving forward.
Thank you. Got another question here. Would you agree that if we perhaps collectively promoted with a louder voice the evidence outcomes and the life skills gained through participation in the arts, that it may be regarded more often as a core subject by those developing school-based curricula, particularly at this time when health and well-being is of paramount importance? I'll let someone else kick off first this time. Nicola?
Yes, or perhaps not even. I mean, a core subject, yes, obviously I would never advocate for anything that was against that. I mean, that would just be absolutely wonderful. But I think to sort of go back on the concept that if we could find ways of it permeating everything that you're experiencing in school, so it becomes, I mean, you look at the list of what Katie keeps referring to, of those kind of almost like unintended positive consequences. They're so much a part of your living, your living, breathing self. And if we could somehow work towards a reframing that doesn't kind of categorize it separately, but allows it to sort of become just more of a bed that exists within your whole education system, that creativity and freedom and communication and yeah.
Okay. Katie, do you want to add?
Yeah, I agree. It's a really interesting way to think about it, Nicola. We've been doing work across a whole range of different sectors, and a lot of sectors are thinking about how their work is for wider change. So you can imagine creativity or arts for change. You know, you're doing the work around the creativity, but it's also about that wider change that you can bring about for individuals, that you can bring about for communities and for families. So absolutely, I agree that it is absolutely central, that kind of health and well-being element and the change that you can bring about as a result.
Yeah, and I think for me that it's about, you know, CFE, the Curriculum for Excellence, in its widest vision, you know, over 10 years ago now, was about that breadth and that wider learning experience. And that's why lots of countries come to Scotland to see what, for all we, as ever, as Scots, don't necessarily celebrate it. We have lots of visitors come to us from all around the globe, wanting to see and to think and to discuss and experience the Scottish curriculum, because it allows for that flexibility and that breadth and depth within individual subjects, including the arts. So I think the more we can do to promote that, and we've got a big conversation about to start in Scottish education with the OECD review coming out in the summer, with the reflections on post-COVID and what we do, recovery. And certainly myself and others are heavily saying, you know, if you look at the narrative in south of the border, you look at the narrative around, you know, recovery, catch up, loss of learning. We don't want that in Scotland. That's not what our focus is around. Our focus is around let's have a summer of play. Let's have a summer of children re-engaging with each other and with their families and with the environment and with the arts. That to me will have a greater focus and impact on rebuilding experiences for our young people than sitting them down in some summer school doing literacy and mathematics. And here's Your Majesty's Chief Inspector saying that. So I would say let's promote that the arts as actually that return and that recovery that can add such strength to our curriculum and already does. Nicola, I see you've snuck a wee question in the chat. Do you want to just read it out or put it in your own words?
Yeah, hi Gayle, thanks for that. And here. I was so encouraged to hear you say that about what we want for young people. I guess what part of the reason we wanted this report to happen is because we wanted to show that it is possible to have artists safely in schools and in communities, even with restrictions. So my question really is just, what more can we do now to accelerate this? So schools are returning, children are going back. We would absolutely love for schools to feel confident that they could begin to bring in more artists. Is there anything more from any of your perspectives that we can do as a sector to support schools to feel that confidence and see that happening more quickly? Because there are artists out there right now who would love to be supporting schools, and it's almost a wee bit of matchmaking. I think that we just need to make people feel safe that we can work within restrictions. So we'd love your advice on that, Gayle, and the others if there's anything more, and anybody actually on this session. You know, if you're from a school today, let us know what more we can do.
It's a great question, Nicola, and something we're kind of grappling with. I think we have to cut schools a wee tiny bit of slack in that they're anxious and they're just wanting to make it safe for everybody's kids. So there's been so many changes and stops and starts and everything that actually, you know, people are being super careful, and that's a good thing. However, what we must do is build the confidence. Now, some schools are doing it. In fact, I was at an online session with some kids from a school up in the Highlands last week, primary 1 to 3, and they were doing that. They actually had an artist in residence, and it was great to see and experience. And certainly, the more we're doing with the education recovery group guidance to try and push clinicians particularly around, you know, guidance, particularly around some of the singing, vocal work, winds, brass, etc., to try and encourage schools to take that forward, to be confident that that's safe, and to then drive the message about, we want this wider experience for our young people in schools. So, I think we can do more as a sector in education to promote and support that. And certainly it's something we're looking at in Education Scotland when we've reviewed the guidance and trying to promote and push. And I've spent a lot of time, I'm on the clinical subgroup, I've spent a lot of time arguing with very learned clinicians about, trying to push them a bit around participation in arts and drama and music. And so we'll continue to do that and try and promote as much as we can after Easter to get this up and running. So that would be my perspective, but others may wish to come in. No, I'm getting a thumbs up from two. Okay.
I think, Gayle, just in terms of the research that we were doing, I think you're right. The time that we were doing this research, they were being careful and cautious, and you're right, they just wanted to keep everybody safe. So we had some reports of people finding it very hard to get into schools because no visitors were allowed. And then we had others saying, well, actually the attitude of the teachers, the head teachers and the director of education all really helps to create an environment where we actually feel we can have those discussions. So if we're able to talk to people and there's a degree of support for the work, then we can chat to people and we feel more comfortable, especially if it's across the authority rather than just on a school by school basis. And I think the teachers really valuing the work and feeling that it was something really important to get back into the school made a big difference in terms of actually being able to get to have artists in schools working together and to get the artists back into school. And a lot of the projects talked about starting small. So starting very small, very cautious, trying something out, maybe trying it out for a couple of weeks, letting a holiday go by and then coming back and just taking your time with everything. And I think just having that kind of relationship and joint working really helps for that in-school work to take place.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. And I noticed we've now got a flurry of questions, and of course the time's running out. It's always the way, isn't it? We get people going. I noticed there's a couple of questions in there about either secondary school timetabling, 1 or 2 periods a week for music, etc., or how do we use things like integrated arts work, or what we call in schools IDL, interdisciplinary learning approaches to, kind of push this forward. So yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we did last September, I've forgotten we've had a year in lockdown, September 19, was put out a refreshed narrative for CFE, which focused on the 4 capacities, the 4 purposes of Scottish education. Main one of those, for me, has been a rounded citizen. And actually, I think we're about to do some stuff when schools are back and relaxed around just reigniting that narrative. And I think arts is a huge part of that and can contribute quite a lot. In terms of Education Scotland pushing and updating the arts guidance, we absolutely are trying to on a weekly basis. I'm at the clinical subgroup. As soon as we get any shift in some of their guidance, we'll get something on our website ASAP. It's really not for the want of trying, but we'll try even more so. Julia, is there any question I've missed there in that we could just maybe take as our last question before we sum up?
I'm just having a look, Gayle. You did a brilliant job of combining a couple there.
Right.
Good technique.
I think I'll just say there's a comment in there from Carolyn. Thank you about the report on Dan's Shake It Up and the programme, which you say you're happy to share the link with this group. If you want to just pop it into the chat, I'm sure people will be delighted to see that. As it's way over the end of a long day, particularly for those of you who've been heavily involved with young people and supporting arts today, it just falls on me to say I hope that the conversation tonight has really given you a bit of a stimulus and a renewed energy to support and invite arts practitioners into the school or setting, or if you are a practitioner yourself, to knock on that door virtually or physically and offer that support. I hope that you will, going forwards, feel confident, in inviting partnerships with arts into your school or setting in a really meaningful, purposeful partnership, because there are mitigations that can be put in place. You know, it's becoming, touch wood, safer and safer every day. We want our young people to have as wide a positive experience of the return to education. And the work described in tonight's report, you know, it illuminates that and allows us to do it. So a huge thanks from me on behalf of everyone to both Nicola and Katie for the session, for sharing your expertise and for your continued commitment to the arts and education, because we know it enriches all of our young people's lives. So thank you very much, and thank you again for attending. We will have another series of wee blethers. We have big blethers that are hard to say, but I've got used to it now. But we have wee blethers where you get more of an interest group that some of you can get together, and we'll facilitate that because it's really important we continue to have the conversations. But my thanks to everyone involved, and have a good evening.
Thank you, and thank you, Gayle. Thanks so much for your time and a great conversation. That was fab.